and I'll go ahead and just read our land acknowledgement. So we acknowledge that this virtual event is taking place throughout the unceded territory and traditional lands of the Tongva, Beech, Tataviam, Serrano, and Chumash peoples, who are the original inhabitants of Los Angeles County. We honor and pay respects to their elders and descendants, past, present, and emerging. This acknowledgement demonstrates our responsibility to lift the stories and cultures of the original inhabitants of LA County as they continue their stewardship of these lands and waters. We are grateful to have the opportunity to live and work on the traditional lands of the Tongva, Beech, Tataviam, Serrano, and Chumash peoples. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and introduce you to our speaker today. And our lovely speaker today is Dr. Angela Elise. She received her PhD in film studies from Columbia University and currently teaches at California State University, Long Beach. She is a former visiting scholar at UCLA's American Indian Studies Center and is author of Making the White Man's Indian, Native Americans, and Hollywood Movies. And we'll go ahead and link to Dr. Elise's book and article. Please note that her current book that you see here on the screen is in our system, but it's being processed, so it'll be available in the next few days. So thank you for that. And with that, I'll end this presentation and hand it over to Dr. Elise.
Okay, thank you, Kasha. And I would like to welcome any veterans who might be here this holiday weekend and extend a warm welcome to all of you who put time aside in the middle of your Saturday morning to attend this presentation. And by the way, Mark Wanamaker provided some of the photos for this presentation, and I believe he is with us in our audience today. Okay, so the first slide I'd like to start off with, I'm sure most of you recognize these two actors, Michael Greyeyes in Rutherford Falls and Devery Jacobs in Reservation Dogs. They represent a long journey of Native Americans in Hollywood. And this journey has been incremental. It didn't start all at once where we had negative images and the next day we had positive images that were created by Indigenous filmmakers and actors as they are in these two shows. It's been a long journey and it goes back 100 years and it actually evolves step by step. So what I discovered in my book is that over the past 100 years, Native artists have been bringing their own stories to Hollywood. And I wanted to write a tribute to these performers, both in front of and behind the camera. The numbers in Hollywood of Native people are much, much smaller than Blacks, Latinos, and Asians. So that's why I thought it was important to go back into the history of Hollywood, give them a voice. There's been a lot of criticism of Hollywood Westerns and their Native portrayals over the past several decades. So instead of dwelling on that, I thought it's time to bring these performers out of the shadows and give them credit for their contributions. So we are going to talk about early Native performers. Who are they? Native actors in contemporary stories, we don't often recognize them, and Native women in modern roles. There's been many of them, maybe not enough, but they've been there. So let's start with early Native performers. As far back as the early 1900s, Native performers and filmmakers have been bringing their training, heritage, and life experience to their roles. That goes back to as far as 1901, Esther and Columbia Inutsiak. They were both Inuit from Canada, and they came down for one of the Pan Am expositions in Buffalo, New York. Esther on the left is her mother, and Columbia is on her right. And Esther was in a very short Edison movie, which was kind of a docudrama. But her daughter, Columbia, or Nancy Inutsiak, she actually came west and she worked for Sea League. She did a couple of films. Some of them are available on YouTube, and she was actually a writer for one of them. So I was able to go back to 1901, and who would have thought? On the East Coast, Bison Company had a number of Westerns they were shooting in New Jersey. You can see the New Jersey background there. James Youngdeer, who's to the right, he's sitting down, and his wife, Red Wing, I'll come back to her, started as actors for Griffith and Bison. Now, Youngdeer went on to Pathé, and he ended up actually being a director and producer. Youngdeer was actually Nanticoke. He was triracial. He came from a Black, white, and Native community. He was born and raised in DC, but his heritage traces back to the Nanticoke of Delaware. He often referred to himself as Winnebago because Lillian St. Cyr, or Red Wing, was Winnebago. But Youngdeer was actually promoted to a filmmaker or director at Pathé, so he started shooting Westerns. The problem is Pathé, being a French film company, they really didn't know the true West, and they were shooting these Westerns in New Jersey. Well, American audiences were a little bit more savvy with the West, dime novels, Wild West shows, and they took a look at this and they said, no, this doesn't look right. This isn't the Old West. So Pathé told Youngdeer to pack up and go out west, where he opened his own studio, and he was actually the head of production or the producer of Pathé West Coast Studios in Edendale. Now, this is Youngdeer over here in his street clothes, and Lillian is there outside of their costume. Edendale is located in what is now the Echo Park, Silver Lake area, and this was his studio back in 1911, and he was head of production, and he oversaw about 150 short films, mostly Westerns. A few he directed and a few he wrote. Very few of them survive. One of them is on YouTube, which was listed by the Library of Congress, and it's called White Fawn's Devotion. That was actually shot back east when he was first with Pathé until he came out west. But here's his whole troupe in front of Pathé Studios, and notice the logo is a rooster. That was their logo. On the other, let me jump to Lillian St. Cyr, or Red Wing, is his wife. Red Wing you may have known from The Squaw Man, the first feature Western to be shot in Hollywood. And she had a prominent role in that movie. There she is holding the gun. It's a tragic story. It was directed by DeMille and Oscar Appel, and it was remade twice, but she had this breakout role. Lillian already had done many, many movies that were shorts for Youngdeer, for Bison, but in this one, it was a feature film, and I would say that she probably was the first Native woman in a feature film. In the Santa Monica Bay around 1911, Bison Company moved out to what became Innsville. There was a filmmaker by the name of Thomas Ince, and he had his studio overlooking the ocean, and we're looking south toward Santa Monica Bay. This is 1915, and that is where Sunset and PCH, approximately that area, and you can see it has changed considerably. What Ince did is he brought over a group of Oglala Lakota from Pine Ridge Reservation, and they were under contract with him for about 6 months. He set them up, provided room and board, and he used them in his Westerns. He was prolific. I mean, you've heard about D.W. Griffith at the same time. Thomas Ince shot about 800 movies, and Mark Wanamaker referred to him as the father of the Western, and that is indeed true. Unfortunately, most of his films are no longer in existence. That is the big problem with Ince. But what he did here is he created an Indian camp. He created a Japanese set, a Spanish set, and that was all sitting there for a while until I think it actually burnt down in the early 20s, and Ince had moved to Culver City. So when Ince brought these Native people out, these Lakota people, one of his main actors was William Eagleshirt. He was from the Pine Ridge Reservation, and he actually had prominent roles in several of Ince's two reel Westerns, which would run about 20 minutes or half an hour. One of the things Eagleshirt did, he did play Sitting Bull in Custer's Last Fight in 1912. Another person who was found on the Ince lot was Minnie Provost. She had many, many names, but Minnie on the left was a big, heavy woman, and she was Cheyenne Arapaho from Oklahoma. Her weight kind of dictated her character roles. She was kind of in the same camp as a Marie Dressler back then, a very heavy woman who would be in comedies, and her weight was often used in those comedies. Minnie was very versatile, though. Because of her physical appearance, she not only did comedies with Fatty Arbuckle, but she also appeared in Civil War films as a Black mammy. And so she had very serious melodrama as well as comedy. In the meantime, Mabel Norman was a prominent actress, and she was very fond of Minnie, and she appeared with Minnie in Mickey, 1918. Minnie had a rather prominent role, and she was also very masculine. Not only did she like to smoke pipes, she would chew on tobacco as well. So that was her kind of personal, or her personality, a very big woman, very masculine. And it's funny to see her with Fatty Arbuckle. Arbuckle is kind of kidnapped by her and forced to marry her. And the name of the movie is Fatty and Minnie Hee Haw. It was directed by Max Sennett, and I believe it was shot on the Ince location. Another filmmaker who came around 1915, started out as an actor, and then he transitioned to a producer and director. His name was Edwin Carew, and he was Chickasaw. He had two brothers, Finus Fox, who was also a writer, and he had Wallace Fox, and Wallace was a director of B or low budget movies, and he lasted the longest, up into the 60s. From my research, from what I can see, Edwin Carew was probably the first Native American member of the Academy when it was formed in 1927. He actually directed about 58 movies. So he started around 1914, 1915, and he went up to about 1935. Carew is credited for discovering Dolores Del Rio. Carew brought her and her husband over to Hollywood, and he made a star out of her, and she starred in several of his movies. This one is Evangeline, made in 1929, but she also starred in the 1928 version of Ramona. And that was restored about 10 years ago by UCLA, and it's really a beautiful print. All right, so I've given you some kind of a feel of Native actors in the early silent era. There are so many more than what I've showed you. They're also in my book. But now I want to point out that the vast majority of these roles traditionally have been in Westerns, but many Native actors have appeared in contemporary roles. The problem is we don't recognize them without their feathers and moccasins. So let me show you some that maybe you've come across, you may have missed. Will Rogers. Now, the problem is a lot of people out here do not remember Will Rogers as being Cherokee. He was born and raised in Oklahoma. He was a citizen of the Cherokee Nation. He started out in 1918 working for Sam Goldwyn, and the first film he did was Laughing Bill Hyde. As far as we know, it no longer exists. We cannot find a copy of it. It was a silent movie, and he played like a con artist who reformed. That was a big theme with a number of films for Goldwyn. And he actually played a white man who married a Native Alaskan woman, but he was Cherokee, and the actress who played the Native Alaskan was white. It was an interesting combination there. Rogers went on to do about 70 movies, and he was prominent. He was also a real star. And by that, I mean his name went above the credits. His name sold that movie. I don't believe we've had any equivalent in Hollywood since. I mean, we do have actors who are prominent, we see their names, but Roger's name went above the titles, and that's a real key for a star status. So people paid to see this man, and they already knew him from his vaudeville shows on Broadway and his roping tricks. So he started out with Goldwyn, eventually went with, he did some comedies, and then he moved on to John Ford later on in his years in the late 20s. He did about 20 or more films with John Ford, and that was for Fox. Many of the films he did, he was under contract with Fox. So about 1935, one of his last films was Steamboat Round the Bend. Rogers brought many of his own heritage to his scripts. When I looked at the scripts for some of his movies, what I saw is that the lead characters were changed to suit his role or to suit his personality and his heritage. Now, that is not unusual. Hollywood did that for many people. They did it for John Wayne. They did it for James Cagney. They would change the characters to kind of suit the actor. But in some of these roles, he actually brought aspects of his own heritage. Every one of his movies, with the exception of one, Rogers played a cowboy or an Anglo actor or an Anglo character. But one exception was called So This Is London. It was a Broadway play in the late 20s, and then Fox made it in 1930. They changed the character of Will Rogers. It's a story of two Americans whose son marries a woman from British royalty or British upper class. And then the Americans go to London, and there's this kind of class struggle between the two of them. And it's a comedy. So they changed Rogers' character to be a Cherokee. And it was interesting how he brought aspects into that movie where he constantly drew on his Cherokee heritage. You may know that Will Rogers died tragically in 1935 in a plane crash with a private plane over Alaska. And when he was gone, the nation was in mourning for weeks. It was a very sad time, but he was loved throughout the country and throughout the world. So he was really a big name. He was also #1 actor around 1933, 34, and his popularity was greater than Shirley Temple's and Clark Gable at that time. So he was quite a prominent actor in Hollywood. Another actor who did contemporary roles is Jay Silverhills. But Jay is often known, of course, for Tonto, which he did on television from 1949 to 57. He was the first co-starring role of a native in Hollywood, and indeed he was co-star. The way he was listed in the credits, he was a co-star. Now, Jay wasn't all that happy with the role of Tonto, but if you look at the 40s and then you start to look at the Lone Ranger mid to late 50s, the characters does change, much to Jay's satisfaction. Jay was Mohawk from Canada, and he appeared in over 100 roles during his lifetime. One of his roles was with Humphrey Bogart in Key Largo in 1948. It was a minor role, but he's definitely there, and he has a couple of speaking lines. He also went on to play Geronimo in Broken Arrow in 1950. In addition to being an actor, Jay was a middleweight boxer. He was a lacrosse player, and he also liked to train horses. He married an Italian wife from the Rochester area, and they had children, and Jay referred to them as Indalians. Now, Jay also started the Indian Actors Workshop. That was like the early 60s. It was a small church basement toward the Silver Lake area, and he would train Indian actors in voice, in diction, in choreography, acting, as well as there was some writing he also did. So that way he was trying to tell Hollywood, we're here, we exist, we have talent, and I'm going to show you who these people are. And he was able to get some of his actors in a few roles. I think it was a Disney picture. In addition to Jay was Chief Dan George. Now, if anyone saw Little Big Man, he had the very notable role as Old Lodgeskins. George was from British Columbia, the Tsleil-Waututh Nation, and he came into films much later. I think he was in his 60s when he started doing a Canadian TV series. He was brought over here. Arthur Penn saw him and liked him. And one of the things that George did is that he often would improvise on his roles. He had a very dry sense of humor, and he would say things like, when the white man came to us, he brought the Bible and we had the land. Now we have the Bibles and they have the land. So he was pretty good. You know, he had a very clever sense of humor. He also was an environmentalist, and he was very active in his own way in the 1960s. He didn't want to associate himself with the American Indian movement because he thought they were, when they resorted to violence, he stayed away from that. But he was an outspoken environmentalist, and he also did a number of contemporary roles. Now, he did appear in the outlaw Josie Wells. He was with Clint Eastwood's movie, but he also was in Harry and Tonto, which is a modern contemporary story. And here he is in jail with Art Carney. Carney had done something, they put him in jail, and his jailmate or cellmate was Dan George. Dan George played a character who was a spiritual medicine man, and he was arrested for practicing medicine without a license. So it was a very interesting little role. And again, he put himself into it. He did a comedy with Bob Hope called Cancel My Reservation, which was another contemporary story. But the important thing is he was the first Native North American person nominated for a supporting actor in Little Big Man. Now, in addition, was at the same period, Will Sampson. Will was Muskogee Creek from Oklahoma, completely different personality from Dan George. Will Sampson had no interest in Hollywood. When he appeared as Chief Bromden in Cuckoo's Nest, the producers were chasing this man around the country for more than a year to catch up with him because Sampson was going from rodeo to rodeo to rodeo. And he really didn't know why they were after him. He thought it was because he had done something bad. So he kept avoiding them, and they finally caught up and they said, "You're the person I want." Well, Sampson was big. I mean, he was like 6'5". He was a very big man. He had a little rough and tumble life. He wasn't so much a spiritual man like Dan George was. He moved from place to place. He was restless, but he was referred to as the gentle Indian giant. Now, one thing that Will did was painting. You can find his painting on the internet, but some of his paintings were exhibited in Washington, D.C., and he sort of used painting as a kind of escape from his own life. Will wanted to be known as a contemporary Indian hero. So there was Cuckoo's Nest. There was also Orca about the killer whale. He too was in the outlaw Josie Wells. He played Crazy Horse in White Buffalo, but he also appeared in, for example, From Here to Eternity. It was the TV series. He was in a movie about Alcatraz. He also did one of the sequels to Poltergeist. So Will really tried to be the modern or contemporary Indian hero. Another actor who's really well known for his contemporary roles is Adam Beech. Now, Adam is also Canadian, and he started out in Canada and then came to Hollywood. And in the 90s, he was very much on the map. A lot of people recognized him, and he played the World War II hero Ira Hayes in Flags of Our Fathers, directed by Clint Eastwood. Adam has probably done more than 100 roles. He goes from Hollywood to Canada. Much of his work has been in Canada, and he went on to do Windwalkers about the Navajo Code Talkers. And for about 2 years, he was on Law and Order SVU, where he played a detective. He was also in Chris Eyre's Smoke Signals. Now, that particular movie was one of the rare films to be made by a native, Chris Eyre, that had distribution, and it was in theaters for about 6 months. Here he is with Evan Adams, and they were like two buddies who had a journey across, or I guess most throughout the West, to retrieve the ashes of Adam Beech's character, his father. They were trying to retrieve his ashes. And it's a very interesting movie because it's a contemporary story, and it was able to cross over and connect to non-native audiences. And I think that's why it was so successful. But I wanted to mention that Chris Eyre was born in Oregon. He was actually adopted by a white family. And it took him 18 years to discover that he did have a mother, and she was in Oklahoma, and she was Cheyenne Arapaho. So Chris made it a point by the time he was 18 to journey across the country and meet his mother. And that's part of what was incorporated in this movie about finding your identity, finding your roots. And that was very much a story here in Smoke Signals, based upon the Sherman Alexie short stories. Evan Adams, by the way, the actor on the right, is also Native Canadian. He did a few films, went on to medical school, and became a very prominent physician for his research and his practice with natives and AIDS. So he did a lot of work with that, and he did very, very well. So everyone should recognize Wes Studi. Wes Studi, like Will Rogers, was from the Cherokee Nation of Oklahoma. He started out in small roles, but his big breakout role was the evil Pawnee in Dances with Wolves. So he gives them a lot of credit because he was really grateful that that movie opened the door for him and so many others in 1990. Well, Wes has gone on for more than 100 movies, and he's a very versatile actor. He played Geronimo in the early 90s. He went on to Street Fighter, Heat, Penny Dreadful, and Avatar. So he is an actor who could do so many roles. He doesn't just do native roles. And he said he wants to be known as an actor, not just a native actor. On the right is a picture of Wes on the cover of Cowboys and Indians recently, and he looks really jazzy with his shades. I don't know if anyone saw The Rider here, but The Rider was a quiet little movie, and it was actually directed by Chloe Zhao. And this particular film, featuring Brady Jandreau, it was really about his life as a rodeo rider and horse trainer. Brady had injured himself, and he had a severe head injury. So the whole movie was about how he recovered. And to do this film, Chloe brought in his family and his friends. It's not a documentary, it's a feature film. And Chloe Zhao, of course, won the Oscar for Nomadland a couple years ago. But what's interesting about this movie is he portrays a Lakota rider. Brady himself is from the Brule Sioux tribe in South Dakota. And when you watch the movie and you watch him, you don't necessarily think he's Native. I mean, there isn't really anything there to say this is a Native American person, other than the character does mention it, and maybe there's a scene where there's a prayer ceremony. But this is not your typical Western. So I would really recommend The Rider for something a little bit different. All right, back in the 90s, there was a man by the name of Tony Hillerman who did the Dark Wind series. Robert Redford brought the rights to it, and it actually became 1991. He made a movie, and it didn't do well, and it went straight to video or DVD. But Redford resurrected it 10 years later for the PBS American Mystery Series. And there were 3 very successful Dark Wind stories. Of course, they have Adam Beech and Wes Studi in Skinwalkers, and it's about a murder and the detectives, I think, on the Navajo reservation. So they are now being rebooted. We should see, it's called Dark Winds now, and it will premiere June 12th on AMC, this time with Zan McLaren from Reservation Dogs and Kiowa Gordon, who appeared in the Twilight series. They will both be Navajo police. So we'll have to stay tuned and see what happens with that particular series. All right, what about these Native women in modern roles? I had already mentioned a few, like Lillian St. Cyr or Red Wing. She did Westerns. And of course, Minnie, who did mostly period pieces of Civil War and Westerns. There was actually a Native actress in 1950s. In 1955, there was a series called Brave Eagle for TV. And it was about a Native leader who was kind of cut in the Broken Arrow Cochise mold, who would run around preaching peace and so on to whites and enemies. And the actor Keith Larson, who played Brave Eagle, he was not Native, but that particular series had 4 regular actors. One was Anthony Nunkena, and he was a child from the Hopi Nation, and there was Kim Winona. Kim was actually Santee Sioux, and John Trudell, if anyone knows Trudell, the poet and writer and actor and singer, he was also Santee Sioux. So Kim was one of the leads in this series, and it didn't last for more than 1 season. But if we jump ahead to the 90s, we see a number of Native women who have appeared in Hollywood. Maybe not enough, but they did appear, and many in contemporary roles. So Elaine Miles was in 5 seasons of Northern Exposure. She was from the Confederated Tribes of the Umatilla Reservation in Oregon, and she had a kind of deadpan sense of humor. She played that role very well, and she was quite popular during the run of that show. Misty Uppen was also in Frozen River. She was Blackfeet, and she was kind of like a Will Sampson. She had a gift of doing nothing, but could maintain a brilliant screen presence, according to the director of that particular movie, Courtney, who I talked to. So she was very versatile. In this particular movie, she played opposite herself, a very serious type of character, but at the same time, behind the scenes, she was very humorous and would tease, and she was much different. Misty went on to do the movie Osage County, August Osage County, with Meryl Streep and Julia Roberts, and I think that may have been her last movie. She played the help to that particular family, the white family, but she really conveyed quite a strength for her character during that particular time. And unfortunately, we lost her at a young age. Buffy St. Marie, everyone remembers her as a singer, which indeed she was. But remember, she was also the first Indigenous woman, or the first Indigenous artist, to win an Oscar. She wrote the song or the music from An Officer and a Gentleman, Up Where We Belong. So she shared that Oscar with 1 or 2 other writers. So in addition to her work as a songwriter and a singer, she hosted Sesame Street for 10 years on television. She also appeared in The Virginian, and she did something called The Broken Chain. And that particular movie was about Joseph Brant of the Iroquois, and she played his mother. So she had a couple of very prominent roles, but most of her career has been as a singer. Delana Studi, a lot of people don't know about her. She is the niece of Wes Studi, and she came out here and she was cast in a couple of roles, including Dreamkeeper, Edge of America, directed by Chris Eyre, and she did some appearances on General Hospital. And then Kimberly Guerrero, also, she studied at UCLA, and she did a lot of guest appearances on television, and her notable role was Jerry Seinfeld's girlfriend. Now, what's really interesting about these 2 women is that they've done so much work behind the scene. Delana is the head of SAG-AFTRA National Native Americans Committee, and she's also the director of Native Voices at the Autry Center. Kim is associate professor at UC Riverside, and she is in the Department of Film and Television, where she teaches acting and screenwriting. And so both of these women are incredibly talented, and they do a lot of work behind the scenes. Another person that everybody remembers is Irene Bedard. The first thing you think about when you see Irene is Pocahontas. That was her real breakout, should I say, voice, because it was an animated picture and she was the voice of Pocahontas. But prior to that, she had done the role of Mary Crow Dog in the episode of the TNT series, Lakota Woman. That particular episode was one of 5 by Ted Turner called The Native Americans, Behind the Legends, Beyond the Myths. And Lakota Woman was the only one that was a contemporary story. Now, behind the scenes in this particular TNT series was Hene Gigama. He served in various roles as a producer, and he really thought that this was an important film. It was her big breakout role. She received a lot of credit for it. And Hene went on, like I said, he was behind the scenes for 5 of those series. Hene he's at UCLA. I think he's going to retire very soon or this year, but he did a lot of work with Ted Turner, not only in casting, he followed and worked with the script, and he worked on the set throughout the series, all 5 of these. So I thought it was important because Hene has actually done a lot of work in Hollywood, in addition to the fact that he's known as a playwright, and he is Kiowa. Sheila Tousey was in Thunderheart. Thunderheart was a very small film. It came out just after Dances with Wolves. It was about Val Kilmer, an FBI agent on the Pine Ridge Reservation trying to solve a murder. And like Lakota Woman, it took place around the same era, the turbulent early 70s, with the activism going on, the American Indian movement and so on. She played a leading role or a supporting role as a Dartmouth educated school teacher. Sheila is from the Wisconsin Menominee Stockbridge Nation, and she did a number of contemporary roles, especially Judge Larson on Law and Order SVU. And she also did an interesting film with Sam Shepard called Silent Tongue. Now, Sam Shepard was also in Thunderheart, but he was a director and a playwright. And Silent Tongue is a very interesting Western because what it does is sort of inverts the traditional Western. And it's about basically women who were wronged by white men. So Sheila portrays a ghost, and she terrorizes those men who wronged her. Basically, she's a spirit throughout the movie. Half her face on the right is a decomposed corpse, and on the left side, she's very attractive. The point is, Sheila is a very versatile actress. She has done many things. She was trained at NYU in acting, and she retired from Hollywood and went on to theater and directing and writing, where she continues to do that today. So there's more Native women. Tantu Cardinal is Métis from Canada. She's done over 100 movies. Her big breakout role here was in Dances with Wolves, but she had already acted in Canadian movies. She was also given the Order of Canada. Amber Midthunder has portrayed a superhero, especially in Legion, and her family's from the Fort Peck Reservation in Montana. There's also Lily Gladstone, who's done a number of films. She's Blackfeet, and you will see her in Killers of the Flower Moon. That should be a big role for her. And Janice Schmeinding is Rutherford Falls. She is Cheyenne Sioux from, I think it's South Dakota. So what is the future for these Native people? Well, right now, we are very fortunate to have them behind the camera as executive producers, or what they would call showrunners, for these 2 streaming series. Rutherford Falls will return on Peacock shortly, and then Reservation Dogs. Sierra Telornelius is Navajo, and she had been working for a while with Michael Schur on series like Superstore, Brooklyn Nine-Nine, and this was the first series that dealt with a Native story. So she is the brains behind this, and she pretty much is the creator of this particular series. Reservation Dogs is Sterling Harjo, and Sterling started out in Oklahoma. He's actually a member of the Seminole Nation, and he did a couple of features, and then Reservation Dogs, that took off with Hulu. And I think he's going on to bigger and better things. There's also a third person who's a showrunner, and her name is Krista Valencia, and she is the showrunner behind an animated series called Spirit Rangers, which hasn't been released yet. So we have a kind of evolvement where Natives go back 100 years. They were producers, they were writers, they were stars or lead roles in movie and TV series. But that evolution has been very slow. It's proceeded in small steps. So what is the future? Now that we have them behind the scenes and they are producing, directing, and writing their own series, I am hoping that in the near future, we see them and their stories in network broadcasting as well as movie theaters. Now with that, I'd like to turn it back over to Kasia.
That was great. Very informative and very insightful. So thank you so much for sharing this. And we did have a question, which someone had asked about whether or not we'll share more information about the Reservation Dogs show, but I think you already did. So that has been great. And then someone had asked Susan, were there any pictures shot in the Conejo Valley?
You know, the real historian on that, I am not familiar, is Mark Wanamaker. I do not know if you would allow him to chat and answer that. He knows all the locations of all these movies.
And then while we wait, someone else had commented that John Trudell is fabulous. I agree. We also have books here and some of his works here too. If you have any more questions, please let us know. We had some other great comments about smoke signals and how they loved Elaine in that as well. This has been great. Like, you are an encyclopedia. And Katrina had posted that she has now a list of films that she wants to watch. And regarding that, is there a place that you recommend for us to visit in terms of finding great films to watch and how we can access them?
Well, a lot of these films I find, because I do go back 100 years, they're on YouTube. So you can get Fatty and Minnie Hee Haw. You can get a few of Roger's movies, but So This Is London is not available. It doesn't exist. You can get some of Tom Ince's Westerns. You can certainly, Lakota Woman was, it looks like it was transferred a scan print because it was only available through TNT, but I did find that on YouTube. So always check that first. You may not get the best print, but always go there first so you don't have to pay. And then, of course, you can go to Amazon to see if it's available and rent it or buy it.
Cool, thank you. And then Mark answered, he said, yes, there were many films made in Conejo Valley. I'm not sure if there is any other information, but that's great to hear. Another question we received was, are there any Chumash people in the movie industry?
As a matter of fact, I neglected to mention Krista Valencia is Chumash. She is the showrunner for Spirit Rangers. And there's recently a remake of Tell Them Willie Boy is here, and they work with the Chumash. I don't know if they actually cast them, but Jason Momoa is behind that movie, and it was just released at the Pioneer Town Film Festival, and it's the story of Willie Boy. So it deals with them, but I don't know if he cast any Chumash in that particular movie.
Thank you. And then an audience member would like to know if you would be able to share with us a comprehensive list of these artists and films?
A comprehensive list. Okay.
That's a request.
We are talking about an encyclopedia. I want to be clear that my book focused on prominent Native actors. So if I were to do every single Native actor in Hollywood, first of all, we have to identify who's Native and who's not. As you probably know, Iron Eyes Cody was not, he was Italian. So we have to go through that whole issue. And I do address some of that in my book, but I focus on the prominent ones, or else this book would be much longer than what my publisher permitted. Now, I do devote one chapter to those people behind the scenes who are referred to as consultants. The many Native people today, for example, in the Writers Guild, they had like a petition, and they were trying to inform Hollywood that don't just use us as consultants. We want prominent roles behind the camera where we can make decisions. So what I try to do in my book, besides touching on those prominent filmmakers, is also devote a little bit of time to those people who served as consultants, who I feel should be given credit. And the prominent one there was Doris Leader-Charge. She was responsible for translating that Lakota language in Dances with Wolves. And if you remember, during the Oscars in 1991 for 1990, Michael Blake was the author and screenwriter, and he went up to the lectern and received his statuette. Right next to him was Doris, and she was translating the entire thing in Lakota for an international audience. So I thought that woman deserved some credit. So she is in my book, and you can find that scene on YouTube.
Thank you. And then we had another comment and more questions. Izzy said that they're generally really appreciative of this entire lecture, so thank you. And another question was, sorry, let me scroll down. Can you please repeat the name of the show with the Chumash writer or producer?
Krista Valencia. It's Spirit Rangers. It's an animated series.
Thank you. And then are there any current exclusive Native film festivals or alternative film exhibition platforms?
Oh, definitely. Now for a good, I think the American Indian Film Festival in San Francisco, the director of that, Michael Smith, he just passed on several years ago, but he was also Sioux from Montana. He had run that, I think he started in the 70s. His was the longest running film festival that focused on Native filmmakers and Native themed films in the United States. But there's many of them around. I mean, you can certainly look them up. I think Oklahoma has a few, Arizona does, New Mexico. They tend to usually concentrate more on Native made or indigenous made productions. What Michael did is he showed films that were about Indians that necessarily weren't made by Natives, but he often would use them as openers for his festival. Like, for example, Dances with Wolves was shown in San Francisco at that festival before it opened worldwide. So there's ways to look at that. Some of them usually go to DVD. They don't necessarily get distributors. Some of them might go to Netflix. So that's one way to pick them up.
I do want to point out that LA has a scene as well. It's called the LA Skins Fest. And I believe Vision Maker Media, they also have virtual film festivals too. So if you visit the American Indian Resource Center's Facebook, we tend to share when that's happening. So just tune in for us or to us. And let me see if we have any more questions. We have a comment. Let's see. I think, oh, Katrina shared it with everyone, but we'll just read it for you, Angela. My Bison Archives, this is from Mark. My Bison Archives has an extensive list and images of films and television shows made not only in the Conejo Valley, but all over Southern California. And he gave us a link. So thank you so much, Mark. And Jane says, The Last Manhunt is absolutely wonderful and very accurate and respective of the Native viewpoint regarding Willie Boy. Thank you for that.
Does James know, did they use any Chemehuevi actors?
She hadn't, well, we'll see if she can comment on that.
Oh, she, okay.
Oh yeah, Jane, sorry. And the LA festival is the LA Skins Fest. And that's more of like, I think, a smaller scale production. And
He usually holds it, I think, at the Chinese multiplex in the Chinese theater, at least recently. And they also have a lot of workshops to train people or panelists from the industry. So it's a very industry oriented to help Native filmmakers get into the industry as well.
thank you. And then someone wanted to know, any Native actors told to not say they were, I think they meant to not say they weren't Native Americans when they started in Hollywood?
You know, I heard that about Edwin Carew, the Chickasaw filmmaker who goes back to the teens and the 20s and so on. There were some people who said he kept it quiet, but when I went into the trades, just about every article talked about his Chickasaw background, and he himself talked about it. So I really haven't found that so much. It's usually the other way around. They might say they're Native when they're not, in order to get a foot in the door. And that's a whole other history. But Young Deer was an interesting case because he kept saying he was Winnebago, but he was not. And then he became Lakota Sioux, and he's not. And he really didn't know he was Nanticoke, though, because it's a state recognized tribe in Delaware, and I don't think they achieved state recognition until the 1920s. And by then he had moved on to other things. So his is a very interesting story. So definitely read about James Young Deer. But he was often, when he was in Washington, D.C., he enlisted in the Navy during the Spanish-American War. And because he was listed as, quote, colored, unquote, he was given menial tasks on board a ship. He was not too happy. And when he came back, he swore he would never again work with the Navy. And he decided to go Indian. And that's where he hooked up with Lillian. And they started to do these shows in New York at various venues. And they portrayed different characters. But he kind of took on her identity for a while. He married another woman and took her identity too. So he just kept doing that. But had he not switched to that Native identity, like Buffalo Child Longlands, we may not have seen him because they were both Black Americans.
Interesting. So I do like talking about intersectionalities, and because we have the Asian Pacific Resource Center librarian moderating for us, so shout out to Katrina. I do have a question on, I guess, the partnership between Indigenous people collaborating, especially with North America and just, you know, folks who are from the US, from Canada to the Pacific Islands. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
What do you mean?
I'm sorry, that was like a jumble, but we've seen a lot of increase in Indigenous folks collaborating together in terms of like films and media, like Jason Momoa and I can't say his name, I think YTT.
Yeah.
And how they're working collaboratively. Is there a reason why they do that? If you can maybe talk about that.
Well, I think it has a lot to do with the movements in the past 5 years in Hollywood. There's a number of organizations or a number of studios that do have training for minority filmmakers, including Indigenous and so on. And when you have someone established like Taika Waititi from Australia, who's done so many, and I think he has an Oscar or two, it was just a natural thing that he would collaborate with Sterling Harjo for Reservation Dogs. So you bring in someone with a big name and all that experience behind them. And the same thing for Jason Momoa, who's now doing this, or who just had this movie released about Willie Boy. And I don't know if that's so deliberate in that they want partnerships and they want more of a voice. So as far as Hollywood is concerned, it's a question of how do we give these people a voice? Now, there is some issue that comes with that. UCLA does release a study every year about minorities and various people of color in the film industry. And you probably have heard they released the statistics on it. I looked at how they break down. First of all, they're identified by producers or the actors themselves. So that you know, people can say whatever they want, just like on the census. But there's also the issue that when it comes to Native people, they are all classified in one category called Indigenous. So that could be Australia, it could be Africa, it could be the Mideast, it could be wherever you find Indigenous people all over North and South America. So if you really want to focus on Native North Americans or Native Americans, probably the representative amount is much smaller than what that study actually indicates. So that's the only thing lumping them all together. I mean, our society does that, Hollywood does that, but I often think it's important too to focus on Natives and learn who they are and understand them, because this is their country essentially. And I would like to see more collaboration among Native filmmakers. And of course, if other Indigenous people from other parts of the world can help, sure. But I think there becomes a little bit, once society and the media start to categorize people, not all Blacks are the same. I mean, we do have people from Australia and Africa and people from Haiti who do not want to be categorized as African American. And we don't want all Indigenous people labeled Native American when they're not. They're from South America. So that's part of the problem with that. But it does certainly get their stories out there. That's the good side of it.
Cool, thank you for that. We actually have a few more questions, but I think we can only get to just like a handful. Someone wanted to know, where did your research take place? Archives, libraries, and did you find that there were limited resources?
Oh, that's a good question, because here's the problem. The further back you go, the less likely you're going to find production files behind the scenes. I mean, these are corporate files. A lot of people forget them. For much of the time, the studios destroyed those files. They buried them under a freeway exchange, or they auctioned them off. So you may have some of them, but not too many. So in the case of Will Rogers, for example, he was with Hal Roach. I only found 1 or 2 scripts, but most of Hal Roach's production files were auctioned off, and there's no way you're going to get into them. They're not going to let any scholars. I once wanted to go into the Dances with Wolves files, and it's Teague Productions by Kevin Costner. He doesn't want any scholars coming in. 20th Century Fox had their legal files and scripts at UCLA in the 30s and 40s and 50s. And 10 years ago, I had access to them. Fox said, we want them back. The end, that's it. So it's very, very difficult to access them. And the more contemporary they are, the more difficult, because current filmmakers do not want to open production files to people. They just don't. It's their own personal files. Now, sometimes you'll have, let's say, a production in the 30s or 40s or 50s, and maybe the screenwriter will donate his files to Boston University. The director will donate his files to the Margaret Herrick Library, and you have to travel all over the place. And sometimes you have to go to Europe and Canada to get them. So it's very, very difficult. With Will Rogers, his Fox files do exist. They're not in very good condition. He also has files in Oklahoma at the Will Rogers Museum. Those particular files, though, are not production files. They're his own writings and notes, and maybe a couple of notations on scripts. Remember, Will Rogers wrote over 3,000 articles. He was a very well-known columnist before he was an actor. So he kept a lot of papers, but you're not going to find the production papers of his movies. It's extremely difficult to get a hold of these things. And you sometimes have to have permission to see them, and then you might have to have permission to quote. So it's a very difficult endeavor. That's another Mark Wanamaker question, but I can tell you this is something that film scholars struggle with all the time. And remember, these are corporate files, or they're individually owned. They're not government files. So nobody really has a right to them, and it gets very, very complicated.
Well, I'm totally glad that Melissa asked that question, because I wouldn't have known how difficult it is. And so that makes your book even more special. Just having that access to that information, now we know it's very limited.
I wanted to mention that this happened in my previous book, Making the White Man's Indian, which was about Natives behind the scenes and how Hollywood producers and filmmakers created their images for the screen. So it was Hollywood's story of Natives. Up to the point of 1970, I had some good material, but after that, it was very, very difficult. So for this particular book, I could go back to, let's say, a Will Rogers, maybe a little bit Sampson, but especially contemporary, I had to rely on interviews. So I reached out, especially to a number of Native performers. It was interesting because the Native men, very few of them responded. The Native women, they were much better at response, but I could only rely on them and interviews that I found. The Canadian newspapers were very helpful because Canadians have a different take on how they present. Their journalism is different. They don't tend to gloss as much as we do in America. So I felt that when it came to Adam Beech and Tantu Cardinal and Nathaniel Arcan, who was on FBI Most Wanted, they really spoke from the heart, and those interviews were not glossed over or edited. So I found it very helpful to understand these people and where they were coming from and what they brought to the screen.
Thank you, Angela. We have more questions, but I think that's it for our time. Thank you for the insightful and very informative presentation that you have. I'm sure a lot of our movie buffs will be excited to have access to this recording. We are very thankful that everyone joined us for this holiday weekend. And again, thank you, Angela. Do you have any other words that you would like to share before we end this presentation?
Well, yes, you're going to find so much more in this book. It is available on Amazon and Prager Publishers, and it's about 300, well, I think it's actually about 215 pages. So it's not a difficult read. There are rare photos, many from Mark Wanamaker, and I think you will really enjoy reading these about these people and what they brought to the screen, especially people like Floyd Red Crow, Westerman, Wes Studi, Adam Beech, and of course the women I talked about. They have some really interesting stories.
Thank you, Angela. And before we go, I just want to plug in our next American Indian Resource Center event. We are having artist Jacob Pratt joining us next month. But thank you again, guys, for joining us. And thank you, Angela. That was amazing. And our moderator, Katrina. I hope you guys have a wonderful and safe weekend. Bye.
Thank you for attending.